The next thing we're going to want to look at is humility. And humility is going to be our ultimate defense against pride. But before we go on to looking at humility, let's take a quick look at what we've already discussed so far. We've discussed a lot of ideas that all kind of float around this idea of pride. First off, you've got this self-image, and you've got this true self, and the true self goes out into the world and acts in some way, and you've got this self-image, which is your internal representation of yourself, and that self-image and that true self can become more and more disconnected as your representation becomes more distorted as a result of the lens and possibly prideful introspection. And as this disconnect increases, you can start to experience dissonance, and this can lead to procrastination. It can lead to a series of emotional issues. It can lead to an attempt to repress a lot of issues. It'll lead to rationalization. It can lead to drug use and possibly even drug addiction. We've also looked at how an inflated self-image is going to affect the way that we act. So when our actions don't align with our self-image, then cognitive dissonance occurs, and we tend to shift our perceptions in order to make them align more with our perspective. But on the other side of that, you can have this distorted self-image, which is going to cause how we act. And so we've seen examples of this, such as in grandiosity and vanity, where our inflated self-image causes us to act according to faulty driving forces, such as vanity and grandiosity, and setting vain and grandiose goals. We've seen how the pride in our lens can cause us to discard key information, such as in moral righteousness, how we will not acknowledge the evil driving forces behind our actions. An example of this might be resentment, and we may feel a sense of righteousness in our resentment and not see how that same driving force has led to other evil actions in other people that, from an outside perspective, we could rationally deem as evil, but we can't deem it as wrong within ourselves because of our pride. We've also looked at how much is to be lost in regards to the social comparison theory and the hindrance that pride has on our learnability, and much more. We've also looked at how to develop an accurate self-image in order to counteract a lot of the effects of pride, particularly the distorting effect on our perspective, where pride makes it harder for us to get a grasp of who we actually are. We can counteract this effect of pride by constructing an accurate self-image and grounding the things that we do, think, and experience on a daily basis in reality by writing them down and creating tangible records of who we are. That way, when we go to introspect or contemplate the true nature of ourselves, we have more tangible data to deal with instead of fickle thoughts and emotions. Next, we're going to look at humility, and humility is basically going to be that which is the opposite of pride. So, let's say, for example, when you're interacting with a thought or with a perception of yourself that is contradictory to your self-image. These are two thoughts that are contradictory, and this can cause cognitive dissonance to arise. Now, the emotion of pride, or pride becoming a part of that introspection, is going to cause us to discard the perception or to adjust the perception according to our self-image. And in a sense, this is prideful because we are deceiving ourselves into believing that we're capable of constructing a self-image that is more accurate than these uncomfortable perceptions. And so humility is going to cause us to be able to consider this. Humility is going to cause us to be able to let go of the things that we think we are and consider the things that we might be by taking these new perceptions into account. And that's going to bring us to our first point about humility, that is, even with a rationally constructed self-image, we have to recognize the limits of our reason or of rationality and be able to detach from any self-image in order to have a continually evolving and flexible self-image that's able to adapt to the complexities of life and embrace uncertainty. So let's look at this idea of the detached self-image for a second. The idea behind the detached self-image is essentially that we can't necessarily construct a self-image that is so representative of reality that it is without flaw. And so it's kind of prideful to think that we can construct an accurate self-image that will never be contradictory to the true self. Even if it's grounded and tangible, that's obviously a step up from just constructing one within your mind. But there's always going to be some complexity that it leaves out. And so the detached self-image allows you to continually construct a sense of self that is ever-evolving, ever-changing, and ever-adapting to new perceptions and to new understandings. Another important idea to remember for why we need to have a detached self-image or a flexible perspective about ourselves is that as we go through life, we change. And so this self-image that we construct is only going to be true for so long. And it's going to be in flux. As we go through new experiences, we learn new lessons, we acquire new sets of knowledge, and so on. The way that the true self acts, or the nature of the true self, is going to shift and change. And so while you're going through this process, you have to recognize that it's going to be ever-changing. On top of that, as you go through life, there are these almost undercurrents to the self that aren't always apparent. So in some periods of life, one undercurrent to the self will emerge, and we'll deal with that and we'll recognize that, but they're contradictory aspects of the self. And as we go through life, new undercurrents will arise, and we'll start to see parts of ourselves that we've never seen before, and we need to be able to shift gears and recognize that different aspects of the self are arising. Two examples of this. One is the higher and the lower self. So there's a self that is more productive, tends to be more susceptible to pride. There's the self that is, or the self is capable of handling more things. It's able to set goals and pursue them effectively. And then there's the other self that's more aware of its flaws, that feels more anxiety, that tends to procrastinate more. And these two selves emerge under different conditions. And it's important to recognize first the conditions under which those selves will emerge. And there are different ways that these selves will act. And there are different ways that these selves will perceive things. I wouldn't say the higher self, but the more high-functioning self is more likely to attribute failures to external events and things outside of their control, whereas the lower or less productive or more insecure self is going to be more likely to look inwards and attribute failures to qualities of the self. And in both of these cases, the counteractive efforts that you're going to have to make are going to be different. So you need to recognize that throughout life there's going to be different selves that are emerging. Another really good example of this can be illustrated through an archetypal example that I think we've all experienced. At least I've certainly experienced it, which is sometimes we say a bunch of things, and this is especially true in arguments. We say a bunch of things, and we'll be in an argument, and we'll justify all these opinions and ideas, and especially when emotions get going, we'll start to make claims that we don't necessarily believe, or act as though we're certain about things that internally we're not actually that certain about. But in order to make our point, we act as though we're all certain about it. And so there's the self that's saying all of these things, and there's another self inside that's watching us say all these things, and going, I don't really believe that, that's not entirely true, that's a white lie, so on and so forth. And it's kind of like, why are you saying that, man? And to a degree, we kind of get these two selves jumbled up and we perceive them as one, but in essence, they're like two entities operating within this body at once. And it's a really weird experience when you become aware of that, and then it starts to happen, and you start to perceive it as two separate entities. It becomes a very bizarre experience. And so part of that is, which of these is the true self, and which of these do we grab onto as the identity? And we might like to think that the more honest self is the one that we might identify with. But we can also see both of these as different undercurrents of the self. In order to adapt to this ever-changing state that the self is in, we need to be able to detach from our sense of self, from our attempt to have a stable, rigid self-image, and be able to kind of let that self-image flow like water, as the Taoists might say. Let it be flexible. Let it take the shape of whatever container is holding it at whatever time it's being held. So a couple of interesting ideas in regards to this, or to make this a little bit more concrete. Heraclitus, one of the pre-Socratics, once said that you can never step into the same river twice. And that's his whole philosophy was that everything is in a constant state of change, and there's nothing that remains constant throughout change. And I don't necessarily believe that that's true. The perspective I generally tend to take is that which persists through change is the process. So in the case of the process of constructing an accurate self-image, it's going to change according to your circumstances, who you are. What's going on there is going to be different, but the underlying process is the same in every case. The actual details of what you're looking at is radically different from person to person, and then within each person from time to time. There's also the idea of the ship of Theseus, which is essentially, you've got this, I think a lot of people have heard of this one, you've got this boat, and it's like vibing. I might have already talked about it in this course, I'm not sure, but there's this boat and it's vibing, and it's called the ship of Theseus, and what happens is, over the course of generations, they start to replace certain parts of the boat. Maybe it's in a battle and it gets a hole torn in it, so they put some new wood on it, and over the course of generations, let's say every part of that boat becomes, or gets replaced, and every member of the crew dies off and is replaced with an entirely new crew, but it's still called the ship of Theseus. But there's nothing that's the same about it from the beginning to the end. And that's supposed to be an allegory for well, it's supposed to encapsulate a lot of metaphysical ideas, but one it can encapsulate is the idea of the self. Saying like, okay, well, there's nothing the same about me from when I was a child. The chemical structures of my brain are different. The literal matter that makes up my body is different. The memories themselves are different. Memories themselves, those are some weird things. So what is it about me that makes me me? The idea of the detached self-image is kind of seeing the self as that which makes the ship of Theseus be the ship of Theseus, and the body and the physical vessel that we inhabit as that ship, as simply something with material truths that can be changed and adjusted and edited as we please, in some sense. And so with the process of, by using the accurate self-image, one thing that we can do is recognize our weaknesses, and we can go in and not see those weaknesses as a quality of the self necessarily, but as a quality of this vessel that we inhabit. And then it's up to us to go and make adjustments to this vessel in order to make it better and make it be able to do what we want it to do more effectively. And so in the case of a ship, or you could call it in the case of a car, let's say a car is supposed to get you from point A to point B the best that it can, and you want it to be comfortable, you want it to be a good ride, you want it to have good handling, you want it to be able to withstand multiple different kinds of terrain, you want it to be fast, but you also want it to be able to stop quickly. want to be able to do all these things. And in order to do that, you have to get an accurate perspective about the nature of the car, and you need to be able to go in and recognize what needs to be fixed in order to make which aspects of it better. And then you go in, and with some degree of knowledge, a bit of practice, and a plan, you're able to go in and adjust or edit that car in the way that you need to edit it. And then it becomes better, and then you're able to go from point A to point B better, maybe with more style, with more comfort, or with better practical capabilities, such as faster. And so we kind of want to see the idea of the self as analogous to that. Another thing that I think this perspective kind of does is well, it detaches us from pleasure and pain related to ideas about the self. So if we think we're all like smart and stuff, and then we realize we're not that smart, it's much less painful to realize that we're not that smart if intelligence is a matter of this vessel that we inhabit that we need to make better, than if it's some implication about the quality of the self, right? When it's just an abstract vessel, we can say, okay, well, maybe it's not as smart as I wanted it to be, but it's better that I know it's not as smart as I thought it was. And so, because now I'm able to go in and make it smarter in the way that I want to make it smarter, so that it's able to do what I need it to do better. In this sense as well, when we perhaps realize that we are smarter than we thought we were, when we're attached to the sense of self, there's a sense of pride that can arise as a result of that. And then, all kinds of things can happen when that pride starts becoming a part of the self-image and the lens, and a part of just the whole complex equation. But if we're able to be detached and see this intelligence simply as a quality of the vessel, we can be as happy about it as we need to be. And so, in the case we're less intelligent, we'll be as disappointed as we need to be, because we go, oh, well, maybe there's a bit more work that I have to do, and that's disappointing, but at least I know, and that's good. In the case that it's more than we thought it was, we'll be, oh, well, that's great, that's useful, and now there's something that I'm more capable of doing, and so I can take on a bit more challenge than I had previously thought, but it isn't some big rush of emotions, and it's not a quality that we get attached to. It's only a indication of how effective or ineffective we can be. And in the sense, it really simmers down any emotions that are related to our sense of self, which is beneficial when those emotions would be negative, but also takes a bit of self-discipline when those emotions are positive, to be able to step back and relinquish indulgence in prideful emotions. So this first step of being more humble is simply admitting that you can't, or that there's a limit to how representative you can make your self-image of your true self, and so you kind of detach from it and allow yourself to be flexible in accordance with your future perceptions.